Hello, everyone. My name is Olka Joshi Hansen. I am Chief Program Officer here at Grantmakers for Education. And thank you for joining us today for the Rural Funders Workbench, Tools for Grantmaking and Equity. We've been so excited to have a small group of funders in our membership who've been interested in exploring rural issues and making connections across rural work and lots of our other areas. So I'm going to hand it off to Danielle Vetter, who's Senior Program Officer at Ascendium Education Group, to introduce our panel and tell you about today's program. Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Olka. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We know you're busy and appreciate you spending some time today to talk about investing in data and infrastructure and tools. My name is Danielle Vetter. I'm a Senior Program Officer at Ascendium Education Group, and I am joined today by my colleague Kirsten Yago, Program Officer, as well as Dr. Andrew Koricich, Executive Director for the Alliance on Research on Regional Colleges based at Appalachian State University. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Nick Hillman, the Director of the STAR Lab, Student Success through Applied Research Lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We're really happy to have the opportunity to talk about tools, and we have a few high-level goals for this session. We want to understand why we as an organization have seen a lot of benefit in investing in data tools. We'll give you a chance to use the tools themselves, and then we'll close by discussing the potential implications of this type of investing in your own grant-making strategies. This session is designed to be a bit more informal and interactive than some other sessions, so please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who you are, where you're working, what type of grant making you're doing. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the session, so if you have questions for any of the presenters, we will be sure to be monitoring that regularly and have an opportunity to answer them. So before talking a little bit more about some of the goals for our topic at hand today, I'll turn it over to my colleague Kirsten Yago to introduce you to Ascendium Education Group.
Thanks so much, Danielle. I'm going to quickly provide an overview of Ascendium. We are a nonprofit organization based in Madison, Wisconsin. We are the nation's largest federal student loan guarantor and a provider of student success services. So many of you on the webinar today know us as a post-secondary education philanthropy committed to ensuring that individuals are able to reach their academic and career goals. So at Ascendium, we recognize that post-secondary education and workforce training is critical to ensuring that individuals have access to meaningful family-supporting careers. And we also recognize that there are very real barriers that prevent individuals from being able to earn a degree or credential. All of our investments are aimed at supporting change through a number of levers, which you see here listed on the slide. And ultimately, our investments are focused on sparking sustainable systemic improvements that support learners in education and training beyond high school. We have 4 focus areas that guide our investments, and for the sake of time, I won't read through each of these. You can certainly find out more information on our website, but each of these focus areas is driven by the same goal, ensuring that more students from low-income backgrounds, especially first-generation students, rural community members, veterans, students of color, and incarcerated adults are able to benefit from a post-secondary degree or credential that provides a path to upward socioeconomic mobility. So today's conversation is going to focus on the investments that we're making in our rural post-secondary education and workforce training portfolio. This is Ascendium's newest focus area, and our interest in rural post-secondary education was very much driven by the data. So we know that disparities for rural students, between rural students and their urban and suburban peers exist at every point along the post-secondary pipeline from enrollment to workforce entry. And we also know that philanthropic dollars overwhelmingly support urban and suburban communities. And so we knew that if we wanted to be serious about lifting up opportunities for all learners, that we could not ignore 20% of the country that is classified as rural. So to develop our rural funding strategy, we connected with stakeholders working and living in rural communities to better understand the assets and challenges that rural communities face, and to identify the ways that Ascendium could really make an impact with our investments. Our grant making in the rural space is guided by 3 priorities, which you see on this slide here. First is investing in high quality research. And simply put, there is very little research about rural post-secondary institutions and rural learners. We have partnered with a diverse group of researchers and practitioners to develop a rural post-secondary education research agenda, which was just released last week. This agenda lifts up and prioritizes the most important questions that need to be answered to better understand the factors that influence the success of rural learners in post-secondary education and their transition to the workforce. Our second priority is about identifying and supporting the capacity building needs of rural post-secondary providers so that they can support rural learners. And our third area of focus is around catalyzing investments through partnerships. We know that there are very few tables set for and by rural communities, and we want to invest in opportunities that create connection between post-secondary providers, employers, and other stakeholders who are committed to success for individuals from low-income backgrounds. One of the things that we very quickly realized during the development of our strategy was the tremendous challenge of trying to define rural. I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, who's going to talk a little bit more about that and how it informed our investments in the tools that you're going to hear about today.
Definitions are incredibly important in education policy, education philanthropy, and when trying to steward collaboration among different types of education organizations. And definitions really matter. They impact goals that we might set for how we want to direct dollars. They impact what type of students we want to serve, where they're from, and they also impact the end result of where we'd like to see out of our philanthropic investments. When it comes to defining rurality, Kirsten mentioned, it's tough. More often than not, rural communities are defined for what they are not rather than what they are. There are a variety of federal, state, and local definitions for what rurality means, and there's also a personal learning journey element to how you consider rurality. Where are you from, and what does that mean for how you make decisions about your education, about your career, and about where you'd like to pursue that education and training? At Ascendium, starting our new portfolio investing in rural places and spaces, we really struggled to understand where the scope of our philanthropy might be. Knowing that our end goal is driving impact and change in rural communities, we felt like we needed a set of tools to better understand what are rural communities, what are the components and characteristics that go into defining rural, and how can we help create tools that will advance philanthropy, not just for the way that we might drive investments, partnerships, and decisions, but for the education field more broadly. We're focused on post-secondary education and workforce training, but I think that the tools that you're about to be introduced to have implications for funders that are thinking about collective impact investments, thinking about the relationships between secondary systems and post-secondary systems, as well as leaders that are seeking to drive impact across certain geographies. Looking at the attendance list of folks that are joined today, we've got representation from coast to coast, as well as a variety of different types and scopes of grant making. And so we started to think about defining rural with a very practical goal, helping researchers, partners, and our own grant making team better understand what are rural locations, what are rural institutions, and how might those definitions impact the way that we are driving investments, partnerships, and impact moving forward. So knowing that challenge and opportunity at hand, we enlisted the help of some very smart researchers, 2 of which you'll hear from today, to help make practical, user-friendly tools to help make defining rural easier, more practical, and more uniform as we think about achieving impact across different geographies. So with that, I will happily turn it over to Dr. Nick Hillman to begin talking about why understanding what rural location means is so important.
Excellent. Thank you, Danielle and Kirsten. I'll jump right in. Finding a definition for an institution is also difficult. And what our team has done here in the STAR lab at UW-Madison is we've tried to understand some basic questions about where colleges are located. And we thought that that basic question was going to be easier to answer than what it is. But before answering it, I have a few thoughts of how to think about why rural locations even matter in the first place. And on the very first level, students make choices based off of proximity, based off of what is nearby, the college opportunities that are nearby, and for very good reasons. They might have a full-time job, they might have support network, they might have family or other dependents to be caring for. You can name a number of reasons why people stay close by. Interestingly, if you were to maybe pick up the New York Times, you might think that everybody travels halfway across the country to go to college. And I do think that the higher education research oftentimes has that as sort of front of our mind in terms of student mobility. But this chart on the right uses some nationally representative data from the NPSAS survey, the National Postsecondary Student Aid Study. And it shows, for example, at the top chart there, it shows 100 different squares, and each square represents a person. And this is just for the highly selective institutions, those that admit, I don't remember the exact threshold, but it's something around 90, or I'm sorry, that reject, about half of their applicants. And so you can see in this case, students who go to those colleges do go quite far. The light shade on the right-hand side there shows that, about half go at least, 100 miles or so to college. You go to the middle group there, the moderately selective institutions, and you see a different distribution. You see a lot of these kinds of colleges enroll students who live pretty close to home, within about 50 miles. And once you get to the broad access colleges, there at the bottom, these are colleges that admit 80% of applicants or greater, oftentimes 100% of applicants. And the vast majority of students who enroll in these broad access institutions stay within just 25 miles of home, the darkest color there, darkest shade, or the next lighter shade, about 50 miles from home. So all the takeaway is with this one is that most students stay within about 50 miles of home when they go to college. And that still, just saying that, blows my mind. And it really helps me think better and differently about college choice. Second point, though, is that on the previous slide, I'm sorry, I might be going too slow. The college opportunities are not evenly distributed across the country. There are some places that have more broad access colleges than others. There are some places that have several colleges, but they're all highly selective. And so there are places that where you live can shape your educational choices. And some places just simply have no colleges at all or no accessible, public accessible ones, so-called education deserts. Colleges are important to their communities. They serve as anchors. They serve as cultural and social and economic hubs. And rural places in particular, the colleges that are located in these rural places are very interested in their demographic shifts, aging population, migratory population, and making sure that they have enrollments to be able to stay open in some cases or thrive in other cases, and also plan for their future. All this makes it challenging with poor data quality. And on the next slide, we'll talk about some data quality issues and what I believe that this tool is helping us understand in new ways. So for identifying these locations, these rural located institutions, the first step is to figure out, well, what counts as a place. And we start out off with counties, but people don't really stay within their counties. They migrate across counties oftentimes, especially in rural places. And so we use what is called a commuting zone. And commuting zones are popularized through Raj Chetty's work on upward mobility. It's basically a cluster of counties, including rural counties, that share a common labor force. And so we can talk more about these commuting zones, but think of them as clusters of counties. So we had to, first of all, identify those places. Second, on top of those places, we had to figure out what colleges or programs are located there. And that's what these maps represent. If you were to go into a pretty common data set called IPEDS, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System tool, you would find one dot right there in the middle of the state of Indiana in Indianapolis. That'd be what IPEDS says is the only community college in the state of Indiana. That's actually just where the home office of the community colleges are, the Ivy Tech system. In fact, you look at the second map, and we might have overcorrected here. The second map, the one on the right, is the database of accredited post-secondary institutions and programs. And this shows not just all of the branch locations of Ivy Tech, but also where Ivy Tech has accredited programs in partnerships with prisons, K-12 schools, community organizations, and so on. So we probably overcorrected. You're going to get to play with this data in a couple minutes. But once we layered the data on top of the places, then we can start to analyze. And we're very early on in finalizing those analyses because the mapping tool is really hot off the presses. So on the next slide, I just want to share what we think is some of the applications and utilities for the tool that we're developing. For researchers, it might help us. I know it certainly is helping me. just rethink what counts as an institution, as a post-secondary opportunity. Oftentimes it's what's available in the data set, and it might not be completely representative of the true options available to prospective students. It also matters for thinking about the geography of opportunity in terms of education deserts and how place shapes opportunities. Maybe for regional planners, in a number of organizations, organizational contexts, whether that's community groups or governmental agencies, maybe you're doing, maybe this data can help with some needs analysis or understanding who's in your area, or maybe places around the country that have similar characteristics as yours. So maybe it can help develop rural networks and conduct need analyses. For educational institutions located in these places, maybe it could inspire some collaborations, some partnerships, or even help identify ways to reach out to prospective students or find areas that might be underserved. And finally, for policymakers, especially, I think about this from the federal level, at least right now, but certainly local and state governments as well, might be very interested in using place as a determining eligibility criteria for aid or funding models or something like that. So using geography to identify places that could receive additional support, for example, if needed. But also there are some pretty nerdy things around data quality, but getting data available, widely accessible to monitor, understand, and evaluate different interventions and programs. So maybe these are ways that the tool could be applied. In my wishful thinking, I could imagine a number of scenarios where this would happen. And I'm excited to share the mapping tool in a little bit. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Nick. So you've heard a little bit about the way that Nick and his team are thinking about defining rural located institutions. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Andrew Koricich, who's going to tell us a little bit about the work that he and the team at the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges, which we'll just refer to as ARC, the work that they are doing to define rural serving institutions. Andrew?
Thank you, Kristen. Good to see everybody. Good to see a few familiar faces in the room. So yeah, I wanted to start our conversation by talking about the importance of differentiating between rural serving and rural located. It's really important. In part, we do have limitations in our existing definitions of rurality. If you talk to people who study rural places, you will find every single person has very strong opinions about how inadequate our ways of defining rural are. And so whenever you have a problem in defining rural, it's problematic trying to figure out the institutions that are serving rural communities. In addition to that, one of the things that we approach from our team is how do we account for institutions that are not in an officially rural place that are serving rural communities. A great example of this are land-grant universities, many of which are so large they have urbanized their previously rural communities. And so whenever we look for those kinds of institutions that are in rural areas proper, you find very few. And so it sort of reduces the universe of institutions that we think about for rural serving, while also recognizing that not every institution that's located in a rural area is maybe doing rural service. Some may be too selective, some may be too specialized, and it's not really doing much beyond sort of those niche sort of populations. And lastly, this idea, and very much to Dr. Hillman's point, is counties are not always the best unit to talk about place. They are convenient for some analyses, but it still, again, doesn't capture rural places. It captures them within pre-established county boundaries, and institutions don't stop their service at county boundaries. They don't stop serving students who are farther away, but very much to Dr. Hillman's point, they're not, in a lot of institutions, they're not coming from super far away. And so sort of trying to figure out how do we get a little bit bigger than a county, while still trying to make sense of where we draw the right line. And so we can go to the next slide. And so for our approach, as I said, one of the things that we did was moving beyond individual counties. And so we use census data to build clusters of counties. And so you have the home county of the institution, and then all of the counties that are immediately adjacent to it that we sort of talked about as a rural area, rural region. and trying to pick up more of that variation, picking up institutions that may be located in an urban county but are surrounded by rural counties. That's very different than being an institution right in Manhattan. And so trying to figure out how what's around you changes how we look at where you actually are. Also in this, thinking about using multiple measures of place. As I said, no one definition of rural is the right definition. They all have trade-offs. They all have their own little problems. They all have their own strengths. And so one of the things that we were trying to do here, in addition to thinking bigger beyond counties, was also thinking more nuanced about how we talk about rural places. And so for our work, we weren't just looking, are you in a rural county or not? We're looking at what is the percentage of your county's population that are rural? What's the average rural population of your surrounding counties? We took the census's rural-urban continuum codes and we modified those because they sort of mix up population size and adjacency to cities in the same measure. And we approach that as they're different. And our data analysis showed that those are two different things, two different concepts that got mashed together. And so one of the things we did is we broke that apart. And so now, in addition to the rural population metrics, we're looking at population size in absolute numbers, but also, are you next to a city or an urban area or not? Rural areas closer to cities are different than rural areas far away from cities. And so it's really trying to use quantitative data to come up with a little bit more qualitative of a view of rural places. The other thing that we wanted to think about was really this service piece. And so what is it about serving rural communities that is important? And where we landed on this for this project is looking at academic offerings of institutions, particularly those in areas that are of unique rural importance and unique rural relevance. And our data analysis showed, some of these are quite intuitive, but the data analysis actually showed these as well. It's agriculture, natural resources, and parks and recreation. And so we built a measure that took the percentage of an institution's credentials conferred in those three fields. And that was sort of, are they offering academic programs that are rural serving programs? And we talked about other fields, education, healthcare, that are important in rural areas that rural areas need, but they're not unique to rural areas. A lot of places need more teachers, a lot of places need more nurses. And so that's why we focused really on these three as the uniqueness to rural places. And lastly, we approached this by looking at creating a score for rural servingness rather than a definitional checklist, rural or not, ag or not. We didn't, that it was an exclusionary definition in that way. And we wanted to make sure we were more inclusive and saying the lines are not hard and fast. The lines are a little blurry whenever you try to make sense of these. And a score allows us to look relatively at institutions rather than absolutely at institutions. And we felt really strongly about it's not you are rural serving in a vacuum, it's rural serving relative to the entire constellation of institutions. Kelty asked a question about repeating the three program areas. It'll be agriculture, natural resources, and parks and recreation. Those are the three overall zip codes that we found. And so our data comes from the integrated post-secondary education data system for institutional data. The Census Bureau is where we get a lot of our population metrics. And we also pulled in data from the Economic Research Service that is incorporated into our map to talk more about the counties and regions where these institutions are located. So we can go to the next slide. And so just thinking about the application of our map tool for a few different constituent groups, for researchers, this was really building out a data infrastructure that didn't exist, taking all of these sources and making sense of them in a way that other people now will have a language to talk around rural servingness in a way that wasn't there. This allows qualitative researchers to identify study sites that are rural serving institutions. This allows quantitative researchers to narrow data collection, what data sets they focus on to these institutions. For you all, for grant makers, trying to find rural serving institutions is not always easy. And so if you have a goal of funding work on rural serving institutions or funding work at rural serving institutions, that's been hard to do. And so this now gives a lens to finding those institutions, both for funding and for focusing work that you fund. For educational institutions, it's about finding true peers. We have a lot of ways to create peer institutions, but for a lot of rural colleges, they're not great ways at finding peers. A Carnegie classification, if you're a master's large, that doesn't actually tell you very much about finding rural serving peers. And so really being able to find institutions like you in regions like yours, so that you can have people to collaborate with, to compare against, and hopefully drive continuous improvement on these campuses. And finally, for policymakers, policymakers even at the state level probably can't name all the rural serving institutions in their state. And we know there are funding disparities for these institutions at the state level. And hopefully by being able to make it clear which institutions are rural serving and how the degree to which they've been underfunded, it gives policymakers both at the state and federal level a mechanism and a lens to focus funds on the institutions you really mean to be targeting. And so again, not just looking at the proper place where they are, but what else are they doing beyond just existing where they exist?
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. All right. So now you have heard from both Dr. Hillman and Dr. Koricich about the ways that they went about developing these tools and why it's important to consider definitions of rural located and rural serving. What we are going to do now is actually turn things over. We're going to go back to Dr. Hillman, who is going to demonstrate how to use the tool. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. And hopefully, Dr. Hillman, you can pull yours up here.
Did that work okay? Hey, excellent. Two things. First, are we good with time, Kirsten and Danielle? Okay, excellent.
We're good, yep.
I don't say that because I'm gonna eat it all up. I just wanted to make sure to check in. But secondly, for participants and also for Kirsten and Danielle and Andrew, this map is brand new to me. I just got it today from our applied population lab on campus. They've been working on some prototypes. We've been giving some feedback. So just as you're viewing this, no, this is not the final version. It certainly is going to be updated based off of feedback that we receive and our own perspective on this. But it at least gives you the idea, and maybe it'll help us feel like we got a sneak peek or something, like we're at the Sundance Film Festival. So I want to start off with a story to kind of orient us to the map, and then follow up with some more examples. But my family is from northern Indiana, Elkhart, Indiana. So if you're from Elkhart, from that area, you would also know it's the recreational vehicle capital of the world. And it's here on the border of Michigan. This gray area that I'm hovering over is exactly where Elkhart is. You could search for, don't copy this down, my mom's home address on Cooper Street. You could find their actual location in Elkhart, Indiana, and you can use this map to locate very specific places, but also to understand the context of the region around it. And so if you were like my parents and siblings who live in Elkhart, if you were in the manufacturing industry during the Great Recession, there's a good chance your company shut down, you were unemployed and had to learn how to navigate the unemployment insurance process and extend those benefits periodically throughout the year until the economy recovered. Elkhart had unemployment rates at and above 25% for extended period of time. And an economist of education would say, this is a great time for somebody to go invest in themselves. They don't have the opportunity cost of having to work that without having to work, they can now go to school. And in theory, that would make total sense. That somebody who was unemployed in Elkhart, for example, might just go in and enroll in college. In Elkhart, though, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit and get us a little bit more oriented here. In Elkhart, we're going to see there aren't exactly a lot of options nearby. What this map can do is, first of all, what you're looking at is the Elkhart commuting zone. I mentioned commuting zones earlier. This is a cluster of counties. In fact, this commuting zone is a tricky one because it overlaps with Michigan. It actually goes all the way up to Kalamazoo. I don't think that they should be in our commuting zone, but whatever. There are going to be quibbles here about the data. The point is that these counties share a common commuting pattern, that people who live in one of these places also work in another, and you see a lot of cross-border interaction. And so the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as Dr. Koricich mentioned earlier, creates not just the codes for rural counties, but they also analyze them and cluster them together using some census data. And so we're using some of that information to understand these places. So these are kind of pre-created commuting zones. We're just taking them off the shelf and applying them to the map here. And so in this commuting zone, if you wanted to, for example, find out how many colleges are nearby, and in this case, this location type will allow you to filter just for colleges, as in terms of like traditional institutions that have maybe a campus and like a administration office, and what your image might be of a traditional kind of place. You see that if you're on the Indiana side of the line, there are maybe 8 colleges nearby. For my parents and siblings, you don't want to be paying gas money when you don't have income to go drive to ththese places. So you want some place that's nearby. And you probably aren't going to go to Notre Dame. No offense to Notre Dame, but they're highly selective and very expensive. And so maybe you don't want to even look at private nonprofits. Maybe same story for a for-profit. And all of a sudden, you're left with one public institution, a very important institution to the region, and it is IUSB, Indiana University South Bend. That's a good 45-minute drive. If you're going to go from Elkhart to there. If you're working in the RIT area, you're not going to be commuting to South Bend. And in fact, you don't see a big enrollment spike for IUSB enrollments during the Great Recession, very likely because people in these areas have far to travel. And so this tool and this story helped me think about college choice, about location, about the geography of opportunity, and what are the options nearby. And not surprisingly, nobody in my family went back to school during the recession. And so I think that this story can be multiplied across the country. It's not unique to Elkhart. In fact, there are a lot of rural counties in the Midwest, especially, that share similar stories. But Elkhart's not super rural. The shading on this commuting zone is kind of a light gray. And so to orient you to the map, on the top right, you see this percent rural population over here, and we're measuring the commuting zones. So you can see for this commuting zone, anywhere between 1 and 33% of the population live in a rural county. It's a pretty wide range. And to Andrew's point earlier, it's arbitrary. We selected these because we have to make thresholds somewhere. But the point is that it's not super rural, it's not super metro, it's kind of a mix. And you can see, though, some other commuting zones are certainly more rural, like the one I'm hovering over here, and south of Elkhart is yet another. And we can even take a look at, wow, there are no public institutions in many of these rural places. And this mapping tool will allow us to toggle between not just the commuting zone, but you can see the underlying counties as well. And so some of these counties are more rural than others. And I'm going to toggle back to the commuting zone, but hopefully it gives a quick snapshot of some of the motivation to the tool, some of the features of the tool. But I want to add one more thing before I run out of time here. I'm going to just zoom out a little bit to give you a sense, give myself a sense too, of the coverage. And so these dots are too small, frankly, but if you squint, you can see that this is going to have good coverage of the whole US. And right now we're just looking at public institutions. So you could analyze this data as a researcher and understand the commuting zones relative to their colleges by public. Let's add our nonprofits. Let's add our for-profits, and let's add those that we don't have yet information on, which aren't a whole lot. But also, let's add the advantage of using this adaptive data. Now, right now, we're looking at institutions that are sort of your traditional, in my mind at least, a traditional college, like the one I'm at right now, University of Wisconsin-Madison, a campus. There are certainly branch campuses, I'll zoom back in just a second, because actually I'll zoom in now. I'll zoom in now because it's hard to squint and see this. Let me just return to this general area. Forgive the lags here. I'll stop there. I think we can use this DAPIP data, which I said is kind of an overcorrection from IPEDS. IPEDS would just tell you these are the colleges, these are where colleges are located. DAPIP says where specific accredited programs are located. And so this might be overcorrecting. Some of these might actually be a little outdated. We're still understanding them better, but you can see if we add branch campuses, lo and behold, now we see some options. Ivy Tech has a branch campus in Elkhart. It's actually really hard to find if you're even thinking about looking to go to college in the area, but there is one and it's new. Probably the same scenario is happening all across the country. We have some that we haven't yet flagged. Let's turn those on as well. No, let's turn them off for a second. We have accredited programs in private companies and hotels specifically, and we could turn those on. Those are viable and very good options depending on your interests and what you're trying to do. If it's an accredited program, it might be what you need, and there are some options there in Elkhart. You saw those turn on, and you can kind of play around. There are miscellaneous community agencies, maybe firefighting units that are training for that profession. We have military bases. We have accredited programs on various military bases. In K through 12 settings, dual enrollment programs that are accredited also pop up on our tool. We have campuses within campuses and centers that are fascinating and something that I don't think we're doing a lot of research on. I'm certainly not looking at that, but I do think there's a lot of potential. We have hospitals and medical centers that are training accredited programs that might not appear in other sources. We have correctional facilities in various parts of the country that have accredited education programs for corrections or within corrections facilities. And we also have extension offices and administrative agencies that all of a sudden we went from, you didn't count these dots, but there are about 7,000 initially, and now there are about 30,000 dots on this total map. And we're trying to make sense of these, make sense of these programs, but B, and more specifically for this group, is we're trying to understand how this new information about these accredited programs and institutions play out in rural places. And so I'll pause there because I think we're coming back to the more interactive part. So let me just stop sharing.
All right, thank you so much, Nick, for that quick deep dive into the tool. Like Nick shared, this is kind of brand new and hot off the press, and so I am very excited to play around with it myself. Nick, if you could drop the link for that tool in the chat. What we are going to do now is something that's pretty new to me, even in this like COVID environment of everything being virtual. We are going to try to make this as interactive as possible. And so Nick has dropped the link to that mapping tool in the chat. And what we'd like for you to do is put that link into your browser, go to the map. Hopefully the Applied Population Lab, Nick, is not overwhelmed with folks going to their website right now. And we'd like for you to take a few minutes to play around with the map yourselves, begin to explore. Nick has provided some prompts and questions here on the slide as a way to guide you through that exploration process. So this certainly is not a quiz. You will not be asked to report on the answers to any of these questions, but just providing this to help you begin to explore the tool yourself. And as you do so, we encourage you to drop questions or reflections in the chat. We are monitoring the chat, and we will certainly lift up those questions and have Nick answer them as you are using the tool yourself. Nick, knowing that this is a tool that you just got kind of the current version of it, and you're going to continue to be making some refinements, wondering if there are some specific questions or things that you're hoping folks can keep an eye on, or specific bits of feedback that you might look for as they're playing around with the tool today.
Thank you, Kirsten. I would direct folks to the top menu. On the top right, we have an option to download the data, the raw data file. We also have a link to the data documentation to give a little bit more details about the data. So certainly ask questions about the data sources and so on, but I think at this point in the process, I'm very interested in getting feedback on user friendliness, the overall design, the features that are missing or the features that are helpful. I already have a few ideas in my mind of how I'd like to update this a little bit, but certainly I think it's more on the user experience side than the underlying data side, but certainly I'm open to any question.
Nick, there is a comment in the chat from Aaron Scott talking about how online or perhaps hybrid options might be factored into a tool like this. He listed an example of East Tennessee State University that has an online Master of Public Health degree. How do you think about online institutions or hybrid models as you consider rural located in this big question of what is truly accessible to me as a student, particularly as a rural learner?
It's a great question. I really, really appreciate that. I think that the short answer is we can't fully address online and distance education in this tool. And so that might be underwhelming. However, I do think that there are ways that we can, as long as the terminology like distance education or online, something like that is in the title of the program, that would appear in the DAPIP data set. In fact, I'll put a link to the DAPIP data set, the raw sort of Department of Education link, if that's okay, in the chat there. As long as it says something about that in this data, we could identify them in some way. So I don't know if that helps answer your question though.
Another question in the chat from Kelty Garby. Is there a way to sort by individual state? She sees that you could filter from A to Z, but wondering if it's possible to get a list of rural located institutions by state, knowing that we have some funders on the call that have national portfolios, some regionally focused and some focused within one specific geography.
Yeah, thank you for that question. No, there's not currently a feature for that, and it is on my list of things to add as well. Although, as I mentioned that, I did not mention this whole location filters, searching by name and sorting by location type on the left-hand side, a sort of a running list of the programs or the institutions that are in your selected area. So as you kind of zoom in a particular area, that list on the left will update for the very purpose of what that question I think was getting at, is to find the specific programs and institutions in a specific geography, but currently not filterable or sortable by state, but definitely I hear you there.
Another question from Deanne Leal was clicking on the K-12 education setting and was wondering how you and the team of researchers are addressing early college high schools. Elevated the example of the Rio Grande Valley in Deep South Texas that has a number of early college high schools that are an important component of the post-secondary landscape there.
Great question, and great to be back in touch. I don't know totally with a lot of confidence on how early college high schools will be treated. I have noticed in North Carolina, I believe there are several as well, and I noticed that they flagged a lot of K-12 locations in North Carolina. So now I'm not so sure about the Rio Grande Valley specifically, but my guess would be that they would, as long as it's accredited, be included, but please let me know what you think and what you see there.
I think we have one final question from Denise Callahan in Oregon. Nick, if you could clarify what the location type unflagged means, and then after that, I think we'll transition over to Dr. Koricich and look at the rural serving tool.
Great question. I didn't give you any details about how we develop these flags. And so briefly, what we've done is we've taken all of the DAPIP locations and the program accreditation data, and we've run it through a qualitative software system that basically does text algorithms to identify words and how they cluster together. And so that software did a lot of work for us. However, you can't do wholesale. At some point, you have to do batch, artisanal kind of work. And so we're in that process of really, now we've run the data through the algorithms and we've caught a lot and have confidence on a lot, but there's still a lot of locations that we just don't have a confident determination on. So we have left them unflagged and they require just elevated review from our team. So we're gonna keep working at them and try to find whether that unflagged place could be flagged differently, or if they just end up being unflagged in perpetuity.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Hillman, for sharing that tool. I am really excited to continue to play around with it after this session. So really appreciate your overview, really great questions from folks as well. So please continue to play around with that. And if folks want to send any feedback, we will be providing emails for both Dr. Hillman and Dr. Koricich after at the end of the presentation today. So so keep an eye out for that. So I am going to move us forward here, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen again and turn things over to Dr. Koricich. We'll do the same thing and have him model and demonstrate how the rural serving tool can be used. And then after that, you'll again have an opportunity to use it and apply it yourselves. So I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Kirsten. So I'm going to preface this by saying we still have some things in development. We have a few bugs that we're still ironing out as we go through. But when you load our map tool, this is the first thing you're going to see. We've packed a lot of functionality into the map tool. So we're going to have a multi-step tour, help walkthrough that'll pop up to help all users figure out how to use this. And it's not about robots flying. So we will have little videos and things about that, but I'm going to close that for now. And so this is our map right now. As we've loaded it, we have it loaded to show all 1,187 rural serving institutions that appear under our definition and measure. And so just a few quick things before I sort of walk through some of the steps. As we've got the default here, again, this is set to the RSIs that at the cut that our team made with it. You can see breakdowns by sector as well as how many institutions out of the total are RSIs. And so out of 842 two-year public institutions, 477 of them are RSIs under our measure. And you see here a bunch of different filters so that you can change what you see as you go through with our map. And so what I want to do first is I want to open this up so that you can see the full RSI, see the full set of institutions. As I said, we gave a score recognizing that it's really relative in being rural serving. So you can view all almost 2,600 institutions that are in our data set if you want to. You can also only see the ones that are most rural serving and have the highest rural serving scores. These yellow dots, they're clusters of institutions. As you click in, you'll see more institutions expand. And each dot is a legend. So 2-year publics, the blue 4s are 4-year publics, the green 4s are 4-year privates. So our model, our project does include all of those components. And so what I want to do is I'm going to reset, this green button here is to reset the filters. So we go back to the way things were right when the page loads. We're going to look specifically at the state of Texas today. And so I'm going to go over to the states. It's a drop down, but it's also a search. So we can just search for Texas, select it, and it's only going to show us the RSIs in the state of Texas. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to select Texas A&M Kingsville. And when we zoom in here, what we see are the cluster of counties that Texas A&M, TAMU, Kingsville, this is their county cluster. The slightly darker shade is the home county where the institution is located. The slightly lighter shaded counties are those adjacent counties that I was mentioning before. When you click on an institution, this sidebar changes. And so it's no longer the search, it's now an institution view. You can link to the institution's homepage from here. We have a breakdown of the different metrics that go into the RSI score. You can see their specific score, 0.5937. And we're going to be adjusting our score so that the minimum is 0 rather than -1, so that that's a little bit more intuitive for folks. But we can see they have 13.31% of their credentials are in those 3 fields, ag, natural resources, and parks and rec. We see population of rural in the county, the average population of rural for the surrounding counties, There are modified rural-urban continuum codes. So this is only the population. It doesn't include adjacency because we have adjacency or non-adjacency in this case, broken out separately. We talk about sector, Carnegie class, some other institutional designations, county traits associated with the county where the institution is located, student body characteristics, and some of these are still randomized data that the final data set's going to get put in. So if you see that, you know, they don't actually have an $8.5 billion endowment at Kingsville, but we will have the actual data in there so you can get all of this information from these institutions. If you are the president of Texas A&M Kingsville and you're trying to find peer institutions, you might decide that you want to look to the land grant and actually find, where are you? College Station. Whenever you click on a second institution, when one is already selected, you can either replace the institution that you've already selected, or you're going to do what we're going to do, compare the two side by side. And so what we have here are the county clusters for Texas A&M and College Station. Here they are for Texas A&M and Kingsville. And our view changed on the right to actually line up all of these factors next to the institutions together. In the final version, there's going to be a button at the bottom to download a zip file that will include a data deck dictionary, custom data files, as well as all of the graphs. So all of these images will be downloadable, so you can copy them, paste them into documents, into briefs for your institutions, and be able to just sort of take these snapshots and repurpose them for whatever you may want to use. We're going to change some of the comparisons that we have here. And so we're going to zoom back out and we're going to go to the search drawer. So where you can actually look at the list view of institutions and start typing if you know the exact institution you want to find. In this case, we're going to look for the Southwest Collegiate Institute for the Deaf. And we come over here and, now it froze on me. Sorry, the server's actually in Germany right now where our developer is. So, and so we've got the Southwest Collegiate Institute for the Deaf that we can click on. And again, we can replace which of the institutions we see in that view instead of the originals. And the other thing that I'll also note when we clear these things out and we close out the comparison and institution views, you'll be able to download the full data set from the map. And as you customize your view, you'll also be able to get a customized data set. So right now, if you were to click download filtered CSV data set, and that was working today, but it's not, it would only download the institutions in your current view and the associated data. So if you only care about Texas, you can get a download that's only the Texas institutions. Trying to make those data files as flexible as possible. So I'm going to actually, we've got everything pretty good here, but we see, you know, whenever you're comparing Texas A&M Kingsville to College Station, they're not the same. There's a lot of differences, even though they're both four-year publics. But we only maybe care about four-year publics, so we're going to turn off the two-year publics and four-year privates. We can also change that we only look at institutions of a certain enrollment size. And so you can adjust what size of campuses you want to be looking at as part of all of those as well. In the final version, you'll be able to select the degrees awarded, which will be a multi-select, the ones that do certificates, master's degrees, associates, all of them. You'll also have a highest degree awarded. So if you only want to see institutions that their highest degree awarded is an associate's degree, you'll be able to do that as well. The other thing that we've got here, we've got Pell Grants. So if you only want to see institutions with 50% or more students on Pell, you can do that. And also if you want to see with high Hispanic enrolling populations, you can do that as well. And lastly, persistent child poverty. You can clear these filters and see institutions that are in counties that have persistent child poverty from the USDA. So I'm going to pause there because I know we got to kick it over and I probably went like a minute long. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to pop the link in the chat for you all.
Great. Okay, I am going to go same thing as last time. I have shared my screen with a few different prompts and ways that you might start thinking about using this rural serving tool. Just like last time, please feel free to jump in with questions, reflections that you might have for Dr. Koricich.
as you're exploring the tool, I'll offer 3 kind of high-level reflections that Kirsten and I have about these 2 tools collectively for your consideration. Also, we are approaching time. Kirsten and I have the flexibility to stay after and answer a few additional questions that we might not get to within the hour. So first, we are seeking to ensure opportunity for rural learners to increase access in the post-secondary setting. This is a large, thorny, systemic challenge that is not going to have a silver bullet solution. So when we think about investing in data infrastructure, we are viewing these 2 tools as iterative ways to build clarity across the field for how we might partner with institutions to better serve students. So one main learning that we had from these 2 tools is there's no silver bullets, just really great ideas that we can continue to iterate and learn from. Another main suggestion and takeaway that we had when considering these 2 tools is the opportunity to use our partnerships with really high capability partners like Dr. Koricich and Dr. Hillman to advance not only the field, but our own grant making. These are the tools that we are going to be using to continue to iterate and understand where we might want to direct our philanthropic dollars for supporting rural communities, rural places, and rural spaces. The final main reflection that we had from these 2 tools is understanding how data tools and infrastructure can be additive to continual iteration in research-related investments. We have a number of partners and researchers that are thinking about exploring and deepening their understanding of rural tools. These are now opportunities that we can, 2 tools that we can provide with researchers on the front end of projects that can reduce the amount of time that they're spending answering these questions, reduce variation in the way that they're answering these questions, and also create stronger communities of practice with institutions that are truly similar, which allows for increased learning and ultimately stronger outcomes for the students that we're seeking to learn and serve through our philanthropy. Kirsten, anything you'd like to add in terms of other reflections or any questions that we have for Dr. Koricich about this tool as you've been exploring it? I don't see any in the chat, but I think we might have time for 1 or 2.
Not seeing any questions, although definitely appreciation coming through for the comparison tool and the intentionality behind the need to understand what institutions are rural serving. So both getting lots of appreciation. I am going to kind of skip ahead here. I know we are very short on time. I just wanted to point out, and this you'll all get a copy of the recording of this webinar, and so this information will be shared again. We have a number of resources that we want to highlight. If you're interested in a deeper dive about rural post-secondary education, there is a webinar that was done last year by GFE that you can look up that has a lot of really great information. And of course, we encourage you to check out Ascendium's website and the website for the STAR Lab at UW-Madison and ARC to learn a little bit more about the work that they are doing. I also wanted to make sure that we highlighted this slide that has the emails for Dr. Koricich and Dr. Hillman. If you find yourself using these tools and continuing to explore after the session today, I know both certainly welcome your comments, feedback, reflections. As you heard the both of them note, these are still kind of in the development stages. And so I know that they definitely appreciate and will consider all of your questions and feedback. Knowing that we have just 1 minute left, I do want to turn it back to Olka and the team at GFE to bring things to a close. So thank you all for your time today, and thank you, Dr. Hillman and Dr. Koricich.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to Kirsten and Danielle for leading today. This was incredibly interesting, and I hope you all are able to spend a little bit more time with the tools. I do just want to highlight a couple of programs. GFE is going to be doing a series of webinars on equity, polarization, and critical race theory. And we're going to start with our first one on September 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern, really zooming into the classroom and school level and what the debate means for teaching and learning. There'll be a second program on September 15th at 3 p.m. that'll zoom out a little bit further, talk about state level advocacy and policy. And then we'll have a third one on September 23rd that will really think about the contours of the debate. So please look out for announcements on those. We do have our GFE annual conference, October 12th through the 22nd, and you can go to our website to sign up for that. And thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.